Welcome to today's webinar presented by Litmos and Fosway. Pull up a chair, securing L&D leaders a seat at the table. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. And now, without further ado, we'll get started with our session. I'm very excited. My name is Dr. Jill Stefaniak. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at Litmos, and I'm excited to be joined today by Fiona and Jonathan. And I'll let them introduce themselves. Fiona?
Hi, yes, my name is Fiona Leteney, and I'm from the UK. I'm based in Manchester. I can see a whole load of folks from the US. Oh, I can see Southampton there. So it's lovely to be here. And just a bit about background. So I've been in the learning technology industry for 25 years. Can't believe it's that long. But I've been in Fosway 9 years. And actually, this last month, when we launched the 9 grid, that was my 7th 9 grid for learning systems. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. Jonathan.
Hi everyone, I'm Jon Hill. I'm based in the Midlands in the UK. I am Director of Learning for the content part of Litmos. So if you have off-the-shelf content, I'm responsible for a team of instructional designers that script and build that. I too have been in the digital learning space for a little while, and I've been in a number of organisations where I had a seat at the table. I've also been made to sit in the corridor. So I have a number of perspectives on this today. So I'm looking forward to getting into this discussion because it's a kind of perennial topic that I think between us, we've got some insights for.
Absolutely.
And so for today's conversation, we've got a lot to unpack within our small time frame today, but we'll do our best to get through everything and look forward to seeing the comments in the chat. But today we're going to be talking about how we can operate strategically as L&D practitioners. And so gaining insights into running an agile L&D function that aligns with business goals and we've got some tips and tricks and some suggested strategies to get started depending on where you're at in your current organizations or the size of your current organizations. We'll talk about scaling with impact, different ways we can discover strategies to deploy effective learning solutions at scale without compromising quality. And then also talking about that topic about ROI, how can we prove learning ROI and what are some ways we can weave that into our strategy within our organization so that we can measure the impact of learning, we can measure the impact of our L&D efforts, but also be able to communicate that to business leaders so that they understand the value and the worth of L&D within the organization's overall strategic plan.
So what I didn't explain when I introduced myself is that I'm actually an analyst, and we love data. And one of the surveys that we recently published is known as our Digital Learning Reality Survey. And this is one of the questions that we asked. How advanced is your L&D function in executing the following? Now, I'm going to focus in on the top and the bottom bars on here. The respondees were given the option to either respond that they are very advanced, quite advanced, exploring, just starting, planning, not started. And if you have a look at that top bar, we've got mobilizing around strategic organizational priorities. So I think this moment in time is there's no better time to be talking about securing a seat under the table. And really what we have been attempting to do over quite a number of years is do this. And back when we were in the COVID years, then we had got this seat under the table because each of our firms needed to be able to communicate and train a lot of the frontline staff in terms of the changes in processes and things like that. And so we were getting listened to, I think, a lot more then. But what we've seen at Fosway is that has kind of changed a little bit over the more recent years to go back a stage. And we're not great at being mobilized around the strategic organizational priorities so much as perhaps we have been a few years ago, but we're we've gone back a little bit, but I think we're still progressing. If I jump down to the bottom line, we're talking there about measuring impact and value add in performance and productivity. And I think here it's something that certainly at Fosway we've been kind of preaching for a while. And the thing is, if it was easy, we'd all have done it. And so that's what we're wanting to go into really, is talk about how can we measure impact? Because I think as soon as we start to be able to show that we can add value, then we will get a seat under the table. So I think the next slide is the reason why I say now is a great time to be talking about this. So another question that we ask, and we ask this every year and have done for, I think, the last 10 years, what are the top priorities for your learning strategy for the year ahead? And forever, for all the time we've been asking it, the top of the list has always been compliance and regulatory training. But this year, for the first time ever, upskilling and reskilling was seen as the top priority ahead. And I think this opens up a real opportunity for us to be talking with the C-suites about skills, because everybody's talking about skills. And I know I'm biased, and I'm sure you all are as well in a learning part of the organization, is that even though the other analysts within Fosway are talking about skills, it's in our area that the action happens. The upskilling and the reskilling is going to happen in learning and development. It's not going to be just in the HR where they maybe have the system of record. We are where it's happening, and therefore we have the opportunity to get our feet under the table.
I really find this screen interesting, Fiona, because I think, and especially today with all of the changes that we're seeing with technology impacting business, regardless of what industry we may be working in, we're having a really hard time keeping up with the technology and finding people to fill those positions. And so I think we're seeing things where we're seeing more organizations looking for those opportunities for internal mobility, looking at there might not be formal degrees yet to keep up with all of these advances that we're seeing right now with AI. So then it's like, well, who do we have right now, and what skills do they possess? And just kind of when just seeing this data here, when I think about how do we advocate for our seat at the table, I think there's an opportunity for L&D to be really strategic right now. It's a very unique time, I think, for L&D practitioners, because we can say, let's start planning strategically and instead of reactively, let's be proactive with HR and start looking at what specific skills are we thinking about, not just for the role we're trying to fill today, but where could we envision this going in the next 5 years, or when we don't know what the technology might be looking like 2 years from now, but we know that we want to have good people in that are going to be able to be adaptable.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we know, don't we, that often it's more expensive to recruit than to retain and retrain as well. And that really keys into this.
Yeah, I think skills is the currency, and I think it's so they're transferable a lot more than the sort of the job roles and that kind of thing. So I think that's why at this moment in time, it's really captured everybody's imagination that actually we can do this. This is actually going to work this time round. So yeah, it's an exciting time.
So we have a poll question. Does L&D have a seat at your table? So we'll give it a moment for those of you that are joining us today. What are your thoughts on this as you're seeing this data Fiona shared with us?
Okay.
So we're seeing 25% are saying yes, 75% are saying somewhat. So at least no one's coming right out and saying not at all. Does any of this look surprising to you, Jon or Fiona?
All right, I'm seeing that actually we've got probably a quarter of the results actually saying no. So it's kind of 50% somewhat, which maybe, yeah, we think we maybe do have, but so yeah, it's not surprising. I think that's probably backing up quite a number of the things that we're hearing at the moment. So we've got work to do, I think, is the point on this.
Totally. And I think it's conversations like this that kind of will move the needle on some of those as well.
Yeah. Hopefully we can inspire each other to move forward and pull up a chair.
I'm just scrolling through our chat right now. Alex has shared, that there's this perspective sometimes that L&D has the seat at the table, but when it comes to actually moving forward with implementation, sometimes that priority gets moved to that back burner. And I kind of think just when we look at that first screen, right, and it's saying, how do we mobilize and get our seat at the table? But then we also see the challenges with being able to measure impact. I think it's kind of like the chicken or the egg, and we kind of need both to be happening at the same time to be able to kind of help support that.
So what you see here, Plasma, is a model that Fosway developed a while ago that I think would just be helpful, if you like, to for a little bit of the how. How do we go about this? How do we expand what we're doing within an L&D department so that we can be sort of measuring the impact? And so PLASMA stands for Plan, Learn, Apply, Sustain, Measure, and Analyze. And this can be as granular as you like. So it could even be, used in just a few seconds or minutes of learning, or it can be days. And so when we were talking about this together before this webinar, something had happened just the previous weekend where a friend of mine was in Tokyo running the marathon in Tokyo. And so she traveled from LA and left her dog at home, but went to, and so I was seeing all sorts of wonderful photographs about Tokyo on Facebook, and then there was a photo of the face of her dog, her Chihuahua, in the foam of a latte, and so in terms of, how did they do that? What sort of skill do they need to actually be able to develop that? So we decided to use that example just as a simple one that we all are aware of. We've all been and had, to coffee shops. And so we were looking at this role of a barista and their job, and there's to serve tea, coffee, and other drinks and provide great customer service. And so in looking at this from a plasma perspective, so moving on to the next slide, we've got the first three. And the thing about plan, learn, and apply, this is what we do, I think, all the time. I think these first three are very much where we sit now. And from this example, basically, planning, where do we start? What are the first things that we do? And I would imagine that a barista was having to learn lots of things in parallel. It wasn't just you do this, then that, then the other. And so you would be planning that. But one of the moments of learning would be to learn to make and decorate a latte. And that could be done in all sorts of ways. They might look at a video, but they might also be shown that. It might be, one of either the manager or a trainer, or it could be a peer that is actually showing them how to do it. And then applying it. And that's been applied on a daily basis to actually be able to, you've got to do it practically. There's a practice in there. And so on the next slide, we then come to the sustain piece, which is that ongoing practice to show that you've achieved and you've maintained that mastery at creating a latte. How do we measure that? It's a lot more difficult when you're talking about these practical skills to actually do the measurement. And I like the picture that we've chosen on here to take a photograph of it. And actually, therefore, you've got if you like, portfolio evidence that you have been able to create a latte. And the measurements could also be in terms of customer satisfaction and customer advocacy, the number of times they might have shared that on Facebook or any other socials. And so, there are certain things we've got to figure out what we're going to do for the measurements. And then moving on to analysing and evaluating what are the next steps. Where do we move from being able to create potentially simple, I was going to say simple, but it's not something that I could do, is create that leaf on the on the latte, but then moving on to the chihuahua in the coffee cup. Really, how on earth do they do that? So that's the sort of the just an example. And one of the things, just to bring back into the Lisa's marathon run in Tokyo, when you're running a marathon or learning to run a marathon, there's a whole load of technology available to you to actually go through your training and go through that. Even the race itself, she again was publishing a lot of the metrics that were coming up on her various things that she had, whether it was a phone or watch or whatever. And so it's using what we've got around us to do that measurement and then doing the analysis to move on. But we need to be doing that rather than just planning it, learning it, and then just applying. We need to know where we've added value.
I'm love the picture at the end. I was telling our team at Litmos the other day when we were preparing for this session, I said I was a barista for a very short amount of time in high school.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Working at a movie theater, and I'll tell you right now, none of my coffees looked like that. So, but I think it's such a great example. But also too, this kind of goes into like learning and training in the flow of work as well, and just showing how. What does that impact look like? And sometimes we're unaware of what that impact's going to be. Just with now, you've got customers, I'm sure, that are now, continuing to come back and revisit this coffee shop just because of the artwork and that extra step that their employees go.
Okay, so that leads us neatly into the 70-20-10 model. So those of you aware of this, you've heard these numbers thrown around in businesses, and some of you might be kind of enthusiastic about this model. Others might be thinking, we've tried this, it hasn't worked. And I think it's surprising and interesting that this model's been around since the 80s. It was developed by the Centre for Creative Leadership, and it suggests that 70% of learning happens through on-the-job experiences and challenges. So how do you get to that chihuahua in a coffee cup? Ultimately, to get to that result, you might need some sort of just hands-on practice and sort of help on the job. And then that's kind of like the 20% element where that kind of those what we call developmental relationships like mentoring and coaching and feedback. It doesn't quite look like a chihuahua yet. It looks more like a corgi. Let's move it forward. And then ultimately, the 10% of that formal training that, I think we all know we're very good at, we can deliver very well in terms of courses, reading, e-learning and a lot that's tracked, classroom based or otherwise, that there's a register and we know people have done it. That's the bit that we tend to know really well. But I think we need to acknowledge that this model emerged in a response to the realization that often workplace training was kind of too theoretical and disconnected from real world business challenges. And I'm amused that we're kind of still talking about that today. But I think we are moving into an environment, into an age where we can kind of close this loop and kind of go into why. So the challenges of doing this and relating it back to getting a seat at the table is often L&D is seen as a cost rather than a revenue driver. It's often seen as something that people throw money at for no kind of return. And that can kind of push you away from the table or even get you pushed into the corridor. It's kind of something that often you need to do for compliance purposes, but there's no kind of tangible connection between what's coming out of this and how it's helping the business. So what the Fosway figures have shown are some quite key insights here as well. So often the challenges are in implementing this model is there's kind of lack of application support. So Fiona's talked about how in our own lives we use a lot of technology to kind of track our performance, use a fitness monitor, train for a marathon and that kind of thing. Because learning really only has a value through application and you've been able to kind of track how that's applied, how well you're doing. There tends to be a bit of an over-emphasis on delivery rather than impact. Get it done, get it out, get the training out, tick the box, not really looking about how it lands. And you can see then if you go outside of that kind of formal learning, how it becomes harder to track these metrics as well, because once it's kind of outside of your function, it becomes harder to kind of keep hands on what's going on and track that. And that then contributes to measurement gaps. So we've seen from these figures that only 26% of organizations frequently measure learning outcomes and just 11% continuously track learning needs and progress, which isn't awesome really. And then that has an effect of kind of limited sustained learning. So about a quarter, about 28% of companies, really only effectively sustain learning in the workplace after formal training intervention. So there's a huge drop off after this kind of 10%. And then there's the kind of just lack of joined up thinking, lack of kind of strategic focus. So you'll see from the report that there's needs a more strategic approach to kind of energize expertise and align learning with kind of organizational priorities. And then this ultimately, to get that seat at the table, there's leadership buy-in issues. So, fewer than 45% of those polled believe that their C-suite saw learning as central to the business, which is, quite a wake-up call to us. And particularly when we're saying, let's adopt a 70-20-10 model, and the focus might be, well, that 10% is really cheap to implement, and we'll kind of ignore what happens on the rest of the pie chart here. That's where you start to get that disconnect. But I do think we are moving into an environment now with technology. And I will say the AI word, if you haven't got buzzword bingo.
We are, 23 minutes in before AI has been mentioned? That must be well. Yeah.
So AI will kind of unlock things for us, but it's using really kind of common sense approaches, but kind of supercharged by AI and data-driven analysis. So I think the way through this to make sure that this kind of 20% and 70% is kind of captured and tracked, so you can see the impact and get that seat at the table. And think about how you can have personalized coaching. So if you had trouble kind of finding the 20% of people in the business who can stand next to your employee and teach them how to make the chihuahua in the coffee cup, we can now scale much better with AI style coaching. And we've already seen that, with things like Copilot and Claude and ChatGPT, and there's kind of coaching conversations that you can have with it. And they're one-to-one conversations. It doesn't need to, the chapter and verse of that discussion doesn't need to go to management, but it's helping you get towards your skill goal. And that can link to kind of real-time performance metrics integration. And we can kind of see how that can kind of flag where you might need to see a particular piece of training because you're falling short of your target. Those of you who use like language learning courses, you have like streaks on things like Duolingo, and it knows where to intervene and what to kind of strengthen your vocabulary or strengthen your grammar, for instance. And then this really then contributes to what Jill's talked about, this kind of workflow learning, kind of pushing all this into the workflow so it comes up in the flow of your work in that kind of 70% on the job experience. And then really then focusing on what the impact of all this is, kind of grabbing all this data together and having like a big dashboard as to where the dashboard is flashing, where the interventions are occurring. And then automating and scaling those learning functions. So automating coaching, content recommendations, knowledge sharing, and really kind of joining that up in a way that we all know we need to do, but now it's within our reach with the technology. And I'm optimistic about how 70-20-10 can actually be realized, and this model from the 80s can actually come to life, and we're kind of living in the future now.
And I think it helps us too with mobilization when we're talking about L&D. It's not saying that all of our efforts should be placed on the job learning, or all of it should be thrown in the social learning aspect or formal learning. But I think making sure as L&D professionals, how can we make sure that L&D has a presence in these three buckets? And I think people start to recognize that it's not just the compliance training somebody might be doing annually at their desk. It's that there is learning going on in the flow of work. There is learning on the job, and L&D has a direct role in all of that, as well as all of that social support that also occurs. And I think when we can start being present in all three of these areas, that also helps with visibility to aid with mobilization.
I think as well, I mean, Jon's already talked about this, but I think the technology now is beginning to be there with AI to be able to track some of the social as well as the on the job. Whereas up until now, for the last 20 odd years, we have only really been tracking the formal, particularly through learning systems, the formal learning, whether that was face-to-face or whether it was e-learning or digital learning in any way, then we've never really gotten to grips with the 20 and the 70%. But now I'm beginning to see, because that's one of the privileges that I have in being an analyst in the learning systems market, is to get briefings from all the vendors and to see what's on their roadmap for AI. And there's all sorts of different things coming up. And some are looking at having the, if you like, digital assistants or coaches or mentors, whatever they're being called, inside the learning system. And so that there is a monitoring that is going on, so that as well, what can happen is that the system itself can recognize that actually you need to be have a little bit more learning in this area, because you know of the questions you're asking. Those questions can be anonymized. It's not necessarily like Big Brother watching you and everybody else knows when you've asked a daft question. It is the system will actually be able to do this and give you direction for new learning. But it's that social element that, albeit if it's social with an AI assistant as opposed to actually somebody that's sat next to you in the office, that can start to make recommendations and be much more personalized in this. I think the other thing that I just want to just mention really is that, and going back to the measuring, it depends where you are in the business, where it is that you, or whether you can actually measure and add value specifically. So if you are in the business itself, and therefore, you know, the measurements that are being made, which could be to do with either selling products or it could be to do with the NPS scores and things like that. If you are learning as part of that decentralized in the business, then actually it becomes a little bit more easy to get the data to be able to make the comparison, so that you can see whether your learning that you're providing is having an influence. Sometimes if we're sat back centrally and we don't actually have that business view, then it can be more difficult, and we maybe need to be a bit more creative in those areas to be able to come through with that. But yeah, I think it, as we've said, it's not easy, but it can depend on the business and where you are in the business.
Which leads us really well onto our next poll question, which is: are you working in a centralized, decentralized, or a combination of both L&D function? So I'd qualify that by saying, if you're centralized, you've got a single budget, you're at the top table, pretty close to it, and you're kind of cascading downward. Whereas, as Fiona's already highlighted, a decentralized function might be a bit closer to the business, a unit, a region, and managing your learning initiatives independently, perhaps with some autonomy over your budget as well. So are you one or the other, or a little bit of both? Interested to see where we sit on this. The wider point, though, about all the stuff that goes on in the business that we don't track, and Fiona's point about how close to business you are, again, you know, if we can reference the bits of that pie chart that we don't normally reference in the conversations at the C-suite level, that's where we kind of get the seats at the table. So I'm interested to see where we sit on this in terms of the central, decentralized, or combination of both. It's pretty much where I thought it would be, actually. I'm seeing 64% is a combination of both. And then centralized at 22% and decentralized at 13%. I've got on screen here. My take on that is actually that's pretty good. I think being able to have that split focus and be able to kind of zoom in and zoom out is helpful, particularly from what access to data you have and how you can kind of be strategic, but also kind of pragmatic and proactive on the ground. What do you think, Fiona?
Yes, it's. I was just thinking back to before I was part of Fosway. I was actually in an organisation, and we were very central initially. So I was there for 4 years, and initially I was in that sort of a central role and looking after the learning system. And then I moved into one of the regions, and it became more obvious to me that there were things that were happening actually within that region or within that business that had an impact. So if there was an issue with the learning system and tracking, I'm just remembering one situation which I'll just mention to you. So we had a bit of an issue with some of the tracking not working, and it was the sales department that needed to make sure that they had done this particular training, and if they didn't have the training and they hadn't completed it, they wouldn't get the bonus. So it was very much bringing to my money talks, and so, but it made me realize much more, because I was in that environment. I was working there, and I could see that there were a lot of conversations, to put it mildly, going on about why things weren't working and things like that. So it can. I think there is that combination in an organisation, but when you were at the business end, it's where it absolutely has got to work, and it's absolutely got to provide value and have impact on what you're doing. So, yeah.
So as we look at this, and this is one of the challenges, I think anytime you talk to an L&D professional, everyone always brings up the challenges we have with ROI and getting that return on investment and being able to really demonstrate the impact that L&D is having. And so some of the things that we just wanted to be able to talk about today, and feel free if you're using other metrics as well, we encourage you, please share those in the chat for everyone here, because this tends to be that challenge where oftentimes we're asked to provide data and we're asked to provide metrics, and usually the go-to metrics are the easiest ones that we have access to. But when it comes time to really looking at measuring that worth and the impact, we struggle with that, and being able to show, because of this training that's gone on, we can prove that we are achieving this particular strategic goal within our organization. So some of the different things that we've been thinking about and that we talk about at Litmos is really looking at what are those knowledge acquisition metrics. And so really understanding the extent to which our participants have acquired knowledge or skills. And I think that this is going to be really important as well. And I think we're going to continue to see advances with this in L&D practices with now that we're starting to see that there's been more of a shift towards skill-based training. If we think back to those earlier slides Fiona shared with everyone. And so examples of this is looking at, being able to do those pre and post test assessments, looking at what are the different ways in which we can measure change in knowledge or skills, or being able to look at what a learner's behavior is, or what their learning trajectory looks like over an extended period of time. Jonathan was the first one today to mention AI. We'll bring it back again. But again, I think we're going to see some advances with AI really helping us to be able to look at that and pinpoint where our learners might need some help as they're acquiring new knowledge. Looking at self-reported learning metrics. This is where we have our learners and we're talking to our employees and asking them to rate what their perceived learning experience was. And then again, we're looking at knowledge retention over an extended period of time. These are those examples of those tests or quizzes administered after a delay to gauge retention. We've also started to see more, as we're seeing more of that emphasis. If you think back to that 70-20-10 framework and looking at the formal learning, but also looking at on-the-job experience, I think we're also starting to see that shift too with learning in the flow of work and learning on demand. And so some of this retention could be coming in the form of that just-in-time learning, looking at micro learnings, just to do those refreshers with our learners, just to see, what have they retained and in what ways are they applying that new knowledge. And then, of course, when we start looking at what are those job metrics, when we look at the research on learning design practices, some of the biggest challenges that we have from an academic standpoint or from a research standpoint is really being able to understand to what extent are learners successfully able to transfer the knowledge that they're acquiring in that training experience to their actual jobs. And that's difficult to measure because there's usually so many different things going on. There's other organizational priorities. And then also as L&D professionals, we don't always have the luxury to be able to follow every single learner individually to say, what are all of the things that you're doing? But if we start thinking about what are the different types of job performance metrics that we can start to look at and to access, looking at on the job evaluations. And so again, this kind of helps to that earlier point today, talking about what are ways in which we can mobilize as L&D professionals, thinking about on the job evaluations. This is where L&D can start being very strategic and partnering up with HR and other supervisors within the organizations to think about how is L&D being discussed in annual evaluations? How is L&D being discussed when a supervisor is speaking with one of their employees about career development or what their next year's performance goals are going to look like? You know, being able to weave L&D into those conversations. What types of skills do they think would be complementary to help them be most successful as they're identifying what their performance goals are going to be for the upcoming fiscal year? Looking at things in terms of productivity. And again, this could be done at that individual level. It could be done at that department level, depending on how your organization is structured. But looking at what changes are we seeing in terms of improved productivity across the organization? So it could be things like response times to customers. It could be measuring, speed, accuracy, volume of work completed. And then lastly, customer satisfaction. This is looking at what are our clients and customers reporting back to the organization and how is L&D helping that? And I think as we start to gather more information on that and looking at the different types of words customers and clients are sharing with the organization, we can start to align all of that and do some mapping back to what are those skill sets that we're seeing? What are those skills that are being valued and recognized by our key stakeholders and constituents? And then lastly, this is calculating overall ROI. So again, looking at those performance appraisals over an extended period of time. ROI is not always something that we can just calculate instantly and see and have that immediate gratification. And so it's again thinking about what's that long game look like. This is where I really like our conversations today. I really like that plasma model about looking at scalability. It's looking at scalability for sustainability. And so again, this is where ideally we'll have managers looking at performance appraisals over an extended period of time, aligning L&D efforts with those key performance indicators. And then again, thinking about the ways in which we can provide real-time feedback. And again, that kind of goes back to that 70-20-10 framework, right? When we talk about, 20% is social of learning pretty much is occurring, 20% social learning. Those are those conversations, those informal conversations we're having perhaps with mentors or supervisors or our coworkers. And then again, with that 70% on the job. And so again, that's where we're starting to see having that feedback and being able to make those shifts and pivots with performance and providing our employees with the resources that they need in real time, I think is where we're going to continue to see evolvement. But Jonathan and Fiona, anything else that comes to mind when you think about the ways in which we can advocate for ourselves as L&D professionals through ROI?
So I heard an example recently. It was again during our research for the 9-grid. And we were talking to actually a factory manager, and his feedback on his learning department and the vendor of the system they were using, it had made a tremendous difference to his production. It was an engineering organization. They were manufacturing and fabricating products, and they had a situation where to train a new operator, there wasn't a great deal of side-to-side opportunity. They were very restricted around a machine. And so what the learning department and the vendor of the learning system they were using were able to do, and they were very simple things, but it was actually provide a digital readout with video, no sound because it was too noisy on the shop floor, but just a video of how to actually do that particular product and make sure that it was provided by an experienced operator for somebody who was training, and then they could do the same. And what he was also saying was that on that digital readout, there was the opportunity to put plans and the drawings, the system drawings, CNC drawings or whatever, that they could widen up and see the detail, which ended up making helping them for things to be right first time, rather than make mistakes and have to redo and things like that. And it's those sorts of really practical, very simple inputs by L&D and vendors of learning systems or whatever, that can actually make a huge a huge difference to the business. And it was one of the best calls that we'd had. The analyst that it was actually a German. So I don't speak German. So my German colleague had actually taken the call, and then he rang me straight away and said, "Just listen to what happened here." And so it's your audience has probably got lots and lots of different similar sort of situations, but that was a really good one for us to hear.
I think that's a really good example, and I think it shows meeting the learner where they are and how technology can adapt for the environmental circumstances. And in that circumstance, it's also supplanted the social element, or almost transplanted it into kind of self-led because of those environmental factors, which I think is really interesting. And coming back to one of the questions we've had from the audience here about that 70-20-10, and if it's a 2,000 hour year, is that 200 hours of formal training? Maybe not. I mean, not necessarily. And what Fiona's example shows there is how you can kind of blur the edges between these blocks with technology. And I would say that any organisation needs to recognise that it's a ratio that can flex with the needs of your business, and perhaps one of these conversations at the table isn't necessarily zoning in on how many hours is that 10%, and what does that mean. You might be intensive on the 10% for certain skills. You might have to do it in the classroom. The environment might not support it, but look at how you can flex the ratio. And I would say that I'd still maintain that the greater portion of the learning should be sort of realistic, environmental, experiential learning, with a lesser extent on that formal training. But those ratios can change. It might be for certain topics you have to, you have to get people in the classroom. But as Fiona's said, there are times when you can actually do it there and then by using technology to adapt to the environment as well, which I think is really, really interesting space to operate in.
I think the other thing about that 70-20-10 model, as you just said, John, is that the ratio of those, the actual figures, are just general ones. And the way I originally heard it was that over somebody's lifetime, the likelihood is that the formal learning would be 10% of your learning opportunity. 20% of it would be with peers, and 70% will be on the job. And so it's not just in a year; it's just in a lifetime. That's the way that the formal and the social and the on the job kind of general ratios. It was, I think somebody just picked those a little bit out of the air. I wouldn't be wedded to those specifically, but yeah.
Well, we do love a pyramid in L&D. If we can put something into a pyramid, we have a tendency to do that. But yeah.
So I see we've been kind of going through the chat as our conversations have been going on. So I've got a question from Barbara. How can decentralized L&D professionals convey the impact of their programs when they aren't necessarily tied to other functions in the business?
That's the $64,000 question, isn't it? I think shop floor examples like Fiona's are really powerful, because it shows the stuff that doesn't show up. So getting things right first time. Commonly, people only start to take notice of your department when the dashboard starts flashing, when things have gone wrong. So I think highlighting why it hasn't gone wrong and how you've contributed to that. Certainly, I think the size of the organisation does play a part in this, and whether you've got a central or a decentralised HR function, L&D function is really pertinent to it as well. It is a challenge. It is a challenge. Larger organisations, you might find it harder to get your voice heard and get those stories forward. But in my own experience, what I've tended to find is the goodwill out, where there is a success story. Most organisations have some ability to share that success. They're usually quite proud of sharing that success internally, recognition schemes, internal forums, newsletters, and the like, just to get the story out there. But yeah, that's the challenge, isn't it? Get almost like the elevator pitch. You need to find the moment to jump in the elevator with the CEO and show them the figures, and it's about getting that access sometimes.
And I suppose as well, it's about making sure that locally within the business, the reason why your business is being successful in a particular area could be related back to, is related back to the learning itself. So, and then that business leader makes that upsell, if you like, that promotion of what you're doing. I think that it's, if we're having to make almost an effort into doing that promotion, then we've probably missed it. I think if we are actually making, adding value and making impact, it will become obvious. And actually, looking at it on the other hand, until it comes to the point where we're trying to, fighting for the budget, more budget, and more influence, if you like, with a seat at the table. I think otherwise we can sit in the background. As long as we can see that we are making an impact, then that's where we know we are. They would miss us if we weren't there. So I think that's, you could look at it a number of different ways, and every organisation is going to be different. The devil's always in the detail for these.
I think that feeds in really nicely to a comment and a question that Lee's posed for us today as well. Lee writes, I've stopped using L&D with leaders and C-suite and started using performance and skills. How does the panel think the way we talk about ourselves, our language, and being more specific about business impact can help us get a seat at the table?
I give that a big thumbs up, actually. I've said for a while that L&D could do with a rebrand, and we could learn a lot from marketing, not just in the way we deliver content, but the way we talk about ourselves. Mm-hmm. And I think that is a lovely way to rebrand it, because they're the keywords that the C-suite are looking for.
And I think too that they understand. It's kind of like, how do we translate what we do into terms that others will understand? Because I think L&D sometimes gets put in a corner where they think we just do one aspect of learning, and they don't realize that we can be very instrumental when it comes to strategic planning, organizational development, and supporting other functions. And so I really like the phrase performance and skills, because those are things that our organizational leaders are going to be looking for, and they're already going to be paying closer attention for measuring as well.
Yeah, I think it comes back to what we were saying at the beginning, that skills is absolutely the currency that people are talking about at the moment. And I think, again, taking it to the front line, another organisation that we were talking to, involved with, was an airline, and getting the engineers to have the skills to be able to go and maintain a plane is pretty serious. And also you need, it's not, just an interesting thing is, it's actually not L&D or HR that can say whether somebody is skilled enough or compliant, even if they have all their certificates and they've gone through all the testing. It has to be either another peer or a manager that is able to say, yes, they are capable of maintaining that particular Boeing 747 or whatever it is. And so it is at the business side that those skills are verified and measured and analysed, if you like. So, but the original opportunities and the creation of the resources and the pulling together of the technology so that that individual can go through the process of learning, then I think it is down to the learning strategy but there has got to be that support from the front line, from the from the leaders and managers of those people.
And we've probably got time for one more question, and I'm sure this one of the challenges a lot of L&D professionals have is that it varies so much from organization to organization. The size of your L&D team, and when we're talking about how do we mobilize, and what does it mean to be centralized or decentralized. So we've got a question in the chat asking, what are some practices for maintaining the quality of learning programs when you're a team of one or few?
Oh, that hits home. I used to be an e-learning team of one. Yeah, so the quality of your learning program when you're a small team, in a nutshell, I think being a small team, you're nimble, you can respond quickly, you've got a level of quality that you kind of can sign off on your own work, but you shouldn't mark your own homework. So one of the first things I would say about being a small team is that, yes, you're able to move quickly, make decisions quickly, even produce content quickly, but you shouldn't be too proud to ask an expert in the business, particularly picking up what Fiona said, the kind of frontline managers, business leaders, is this going to work for you? Is this actually scratching the itch? Is it actually going to do what it needs to do? Because the tendency in small teams I found, and I was guilty of it myself, is you can get into maybe a view of things and take some biases into a situation that you wouldn't have necessarily in a bigger team where you've perhaps got a more rounded production process. You don't make as many leaps or assumptions from your needs analysis to delivery that you might make in a smaller team. But the politician's answer to this, the truth is somewhere in the middle. Sometimes we do need to move quickly, and we do need to deliver at scale and to timelines and to deadlines. And small teams are great at that, particularly when you've got a small team are very good at doing what they do. Just stepping back. Small team syndrome for me can sometimes be a bit more of a kind of task-focused view rather than a strategic view. Exactly what we're talking about today. You're kind of buried doing the do rather than thinking about what will this do. Would be my take on it.
I think as well, it is a great opportunity to use the subject matter expert. And these days, again, with the learning systems, and I know Litmos have either launched or are about to launch some AI is supporting their authoring tools, so that it actually can help those SMEs create content, for example, that is maybe close to what a professional instructional designer would do, and therefore being able to expand your team by using those subject matter experts so that you're not having to create everything and do everything. I think, again, such a time as this and all the AI that is being used and about to be used, I think some of it can be a bit text heavy, but I think when you've got certainly the background that Litmos has in content development and the way that they have created the AI, I had a look at what they were doing on that, and so there is much more of an opportunity now, even if you're just a team of one, to be able to cover a lot more than perhaps even 3 or 4 years ago you would have been able to do.
Absolutely. Good plug for the content author.
Yeah, I thought I could do that. You can't. I could.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for everyone for joining us today. We hope that this conversation has inspired each of you to enhance or launch your own continuous onboarding programs. And thanks to our wonderful hosts. Thank you so much, Jon and Fiona, for joining me today and contributing your invaluable insights. Just a quick reminder for our attendees, this presentation was recorded and will be made available to you via the email that you registered with. So again, thank you so much for joining us. And from wherever you're tuning in, we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.